Hello everyone and welcome back. Before I start with the video, I want to say a quick thank you for your support and order so far. I have new art in my shop, prints and originals, hand-painted phone cases, and also a new one-of-a-kind mouth charm, which is made with clay and hand-painted by me. Click the link below and head over to my shop right now. But for now guys, get ready, keep your flashlight close, because these 5 scary stories will drag you into the darkness tonight. When you are in a maximum security psychiatric ward, you are only allowed to have pencils and pens for a limited amount of time. I will write what happened as quickly as I can before they take my pen away. Please deliver this letter to anyone that will read it, as it is very important for everyone to know what happened before I am sent to prison. Thank you. On October 20th, 2015, something terrible happened. Let's start at the night before, on October 19th at 10:15 p.m. It was a normal night. I came home late from work and laid in bed and played with my phone like usual. I started to feel my heavy eyes drop, so I set my phone down and drifted to a calm sleep. But not for long. I awoke in the middle of the night with a feeling of something watching me. I looked around my room from my bed and saw nothing in the dark. I felt uneasy, like a feeling of dread. I was 19 years old, lived with my parents and baby brother, and to my embarrassment, I still suffered from nightmares. It was normal for me to have the feeling of being awakened by something not feeling right, and at first, I blamed it on this. I could not go back to sleep though. I also noticed that I could read my posters and I could read my bedside clock, which said 3:46 a.m. I remember hearing somewhere that you can't read in your dreams, although I have no idea how true that is. I wasn't dreaming, I was sure of it. I sat up and gave a small hello in the dark, and as soon as I heard my own voice, I felt silly. Nothing answered back except my own breathing. I just felt like something was in my room. I slid out of bed and went to check on my parents, mostly to make myself feel grounded or normal. I wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy or that I wasn't getting an eerie feeling from an intruder in the house. I stepped downstairs and tiptoed down the hallway to my parents' room. I opened their door and it was so quiet, no breathing or shuffling or anything coming from their dark room. I let out a small, "Mom? Dad?" No answers, not even a frustrated sigh of being woken up. I tried again, a little louder this time. "Mom? Dad?" Silence filled my head and ears. I began to get that prickly feeling on my skin, like something was about to happen. Maybe something would jump out or yell suddenly. Worried, I reached for the light switch and blinked and shielded my eyes from the bright light. I gasped loudly from what I saw. My mother and father were laying both on their sides facing me. Both of them had their eyes wide open, more open than I had ever seen them. The whites in them were now a dull pink and glazed over. My legs backpedaled until I hit the opposite side of the hallway from their door. I could not take my eyes off of their dead stare. No blinking, no moving. I regained myself and slowly walked towards their bed. Were they dead? How could they be dead? They weren't dead. Both of their mouths cracked open in a unison. They let out a breathy whisper. "Hope you are ready." I realized I was sweating, and the sound of that breathy tone sounded like the air was being punched out of their bodies. I backed up again until my back slammed into the hallway wall. I didn't think. I just ran towards the front door of the house. I just needed to get out, to get away. I didn't know what was going on. I just wanted to leave. As I ran past the TV in the living room, I heard the familiar, like someone had turned the TV on. No one was in the room except me, and the remote was on the table where Dad left it last. I stopped in my tracks and stared into the slowly focusing on TV. I was terrified. My heartbeat deafened my own ears, but what I saw on the TV wasn't as disturbing as I was expecting. It was a man standing in a brightly colored suit. He had slicked hair parted down the sides, and he held a few big cards in his hand. It seemed like a kid's show. There was no music or sound. He stared right into my eyes. He was holding me there with his gaze. His big bluish-green eyes shimmered, and he quickly flashed a somewhat friendly smile. He wasn't ugly or disgusting, but there was something off about him. He was standing in front of just a plain white background, which made the oranges and yellows and reds and blues of his suit seem even brighter. I watched as he grabbed the large cards in his hand, turned them so I could see what was on them. He held them up next to his head as the camera zoomed in, uncomfortably, until you could only see his face and the cards he held. They were the kinds of cards you would have for a child. They had a picture of an animal and the letter that the animal's name starts with. The first one read, E is for elephant. He flipped the next card. He was still smiling. F is for fox. He showed the next one. G is for giraffe. I didn't notice that his smile was growing as he was flipping. H is for hope. I was too scared to know what the next cards may say. Y is for you are. I held my breath. R is for ready. I shifted my eyes from the cards to his face and saw that his teeth were now showing in his smile. They looked too big for his mouth, and it seemed like his lips struggled to cover the molars on the side of his face. His smile grew so large that I thought his face would break apart from ear to ear. I broke from his gaze and fled to the front door. I tried every cliché that you see in horror movies to try to get the door to budge. I shook the handle. I bounced on the door. I even yelled and screamed for help, for anyone to hear me or help me. As my hands became raw and sore from the banging, I could hear a slight sound. The sound of shuffling cards behind my head. I could feel the wind of the cards on the back of my neck, and I stood still. I didn't want to exist. Not now. I didn't want to look. I felt like if I didn't look, he would not exist. Before I knew it, I realized I had not taken a breath for some time. I felt dizzy and hazy. Tunnel vision took over my eyes. The door fogged over with darkness, and I fell into a crumpled pile of the floor at the base of the door. I awoke the next morning to bright sun coming through my window and the sound of dishes clanking in the kitchen. I heard my mom and dad talking and laughing. I think my baby brother was still asleep. I could smell breakfast. Whatever that nightmare was last night, it was over now. Everything was normal and seemed bright. I went downstairs to find Mom and Dad in their robes with messy bed hair. Their eyes were normal. Mom turned to me and gave me a questionable look. Are you okay? You look scared or something? I mumbled to find my words. But what is going on? My dad butted in. You feeling okay? Did you have one of your nightmares? I verbally processed it. I guess I did. Yeah, that's all what it is. I think I just stayed up too late. I went upstairs to my room, laughed at myself for being so gullible at my own mind. I hated to work and thought nothing more of what had happened. I came home late from work. I was exhausted and too tired to eat. Mom and Dad were in bed already, and the house was silent. I laid in bed in my clothes and fell asleep almost instantly. I gasped awake to a dark shadowy figure looming over me. The sound of shuffling cards filled the silence. I tried to move and noticed that there was a hand over my mouth and now another one over my eyes. The hand on my mouth slipped its thumb into the inside of my cheek and I clenched my jaw tightly so it couldn't open my mouth. The other hand lifted off my eyes and did the same to the other side of my mouth, and I laid there, stapled to the bed by the pressure of the hands pushing down, hooking into my inner mouth. Both hands started stretching my mouth until I thought my lips would tear. I screamed and opened my jaws to take the tension off of the pulling of my mouth. I shouldn't have done that. I should have just let them rip my mouth from ear to ear. One hand slipped in between my teeth and pushed hard down into my tongue and throat, and I started to gag and gasp for air. The other hand disappeared behind the figure. I couldn't see much of anything behind the tears in the dark of my room. It stopped plunging its fingers into my throat, and I heard a familiar breathy whisper, "Hope you are ready." I tried to squirm out of his hold, and the fingers just pushed harder and deeper into my throat and tongue. I thought for sure they would push out of the back of my head. I scratched and grabbed and pulled the arm attached to the hand. It was useless. The other hand returned with something very large, maybe the size of a cantaloupe. It started forcing the object into my mouth, and I tried to stretch my jaws open in order to save my teeth from snapping off from the pressure. My teeth scraped and tore at it. The pressure made my eyes bulge and the corners of my mouth tore as both hands now pushing downwards to force this thing into my mouth. I felt dizzy from not breathing and from the pain and was relieved by the feeling of passing out. I awoke with everyone normal once again. I could hear Mom and Dad downstairs, and the sun shined through the window again. My jaw ached slightly. I ran downstairs, but this time I was not welcomed in the same way. Mom turned to look at me and dropped the pan she was holding. She slowly fainted to the floor. My dad's mouth dropped open and his eyes were wide. I was confused. I moved my mouth to say, "What's wrong?" But all that came out was bloody garble. I splat blood on the floor and looked down to see. I was covered in blood. I looked at where I had spat and noticed a tooth in the puddle. I grabbed my mouth, too scared to look in the mirror. My mouth felt deformed and broken. I was too scared to ask what had happened. I was too scared to know why my stomach was stretched and full. I was too scared to know why my jaw was broken or why most of my teeth were broken. Lastly, I was too scared to know where my baby brother was. I am typing this up in the police station right now. Just got done with my third round of questions. This happened last night, and needless to say, I still can't fully process what happened, so I will write it down and see if it helps. A week ago, I moved into my first student home for university. I took a year off, worked my hands to the bone, and managed to scrape enough cash to get a nice town home with my roommates and enough spending money to put in a little furniture. I moved 10 hours away from my small town on the outskirts of butt-fuck nowhere and absolutely nothing, so I was pretty excited to experience life in the big city. I ordered my stuff online, and instead of shipping it to my new house, they dumped it off of the front lawn of my childhood home instead. I was pissed and about to make the trip down to collect what I could when the news broke out that there was a prison break. The only interesting thing about my little town was the asylum, nestled deep in the forest, that surrounded where I grew up. It wasn't a funny farm. This place was for the worst of the worst. The cannibals, the violently deranged, all were collected in the crumbling brick building hidden deep inside an evergreen forest. Apparently, a journalist snuck in one day and documented the rampant abuse the inmates suffered at the place and brought it to the authorities. They rushed in and shut the place down around the same time I was signing my acceptance letters. As I was moving out, they were in the process of relocating the prisoners and slapping the staff in iron. They saved the most violent for last, and a little mix-up resulted in 4 of the lunatics jumping a guard and escaping into the night. I decided to stay put until they captured the crazies that were running loose where I grew up, and I managed to convince my parents to stuff my furniture in the garage and skip down until they were all locked up. After about a week, they managed to round up 3 of the 4 and decided that the last one was long gone. So I headed back home. I got to my house and saw that the place was ransacked. Money was stolen, and shit was just in general torn up. Bastards even stole our dog. My family suspected it was one of the escaped mental patients, but the police claimed that since valuables were stolen, it was just a general robbery, and there was nothing to worry about. I made sure they had someone watching the home anyway, and began the long drive back to my new home. I began decorating my place the second I got back. I am a fairly sizable guy, so moving the furniture by myself was not a big deal. But the wardrobe felt like a million tons. I said fuck it and left it in the truck. I was exhausted and it wasn't going anywhere. The next day, I went outside to see a guy I didn't recognize sitting on my truck. I yelled out hello and he introduced himself as David, my neighbor. We immediately hit it off and he offered to help me move the rest of my stuff in. We both of us lifting the wardrobe and we dropped it right in my room. I ordered a pizza and offered to share a beer with the guy later. He happily agreed but said he didn't do bar or clubs. He didn't look like a bar guy, so I laughed it off, offered to keep the night low-key. He came over later and we began drinking. For someone who didn't like bars, he drank his weight in beer in half the time I did and continued to pressure me to catching up. By 11 p.m., I was tipsy to the point of falling over, so I called it a night. He seemed disappointed, but I promised next week I'd drink him under the table, and that lifted his spirits. I collapsed in my bed and swiftly passed out. I slept like a log until 2 a.m., when a loud thumping from David's house woke me up. Dizzy and still not fully sober, I stumbled to the bathroom and tried to get some water in my system. I had drunk my fill when a soft click made me jerk my head back to my room. 2 more hollow clicks shot an arrow of anxiety into my gut. It didn't sound like someone trying to break in, nor did it sound like someone tapping on a window. It went silent for a while. Adrenaline filtered the remaining alcohol of my system, and I tiptoed downstairs to grab something to eat to calm my nerves. My countertop was a bloody mess. The raw beef I had in the freezer was everywhere, and there were these weird pink and red scraps all over the floor and counter. I was in the middle of debating whether or not an animal or a person broke in when another thump from David's house jump-startled my heart back to a runner's pace. Something was going on his house. I creeped back into my room to grab my baseball bat when I heard another click. There was no mistaking, and this one was under my bed. They began to sound wet, emitting a fleshy clunk. Each time they sounded, they were loud and frequent, speeding up every time I took a step closer. My head still foggy, I turned on my phone flashlight and dropped to the floor. My light illuminated David's face, splattered with blood, with a hollow look on his face. He seemed to completely change his look overnight. His face was gaunt, and his lips were completely pulled back. He emitted an inhuman scream and crawled like a spider from under my bed. I was in such shock I was barely able to stop him from plunging his thumbs into my eyes. He pinned me to the wall and began gnashing his teeth in my face, each bite emitting an awful click that still resounds in my ears. We wrestled, but I was able to overpower him and send his head into my window. I only meant to stun the guy, but instead I put his head completely through it. He yelped like a wounded animal and yanked his head back through the stolen glass. His face was littered in deep cuts, blooming with crimson blood. He screamed and pulled a massive shard of glass with his bare hands from the hole in my window. We stared at each other for a second. Then he dragged the piece along his forearm, with his bloody hands licking it dry. When he was done, he leaped forward and tried to send the glass into my chest. I easily sidestepped the attempt and let him trip into the wall. I grabbed the bat and with a scream of my own, I brought it upwards, colliding with his jaw. A sickening crack filled my ears as I watched his disgusting teeth shatter and fly from his blood-filled mouth. He collapsed to the ground and I sank to my knees. I crawled to my phone and called the police, my entire body numb and terrified. As I lay staring at the broken body of my neighbor, another thump emitted from his house. I would have ignored it until I heard a hoarse voice scream for help. I tied the attacker's arms with a blanket and ran into my neighbor's house. In the master bedroom, I found the real David. He was hogtied on his bed. The skin from his fingers, toes and shins were completely flayed. As I was untying him, the cops arrived and took me and the intruder to the police station. After a couple hours, the police came back with their full statement. They identified the attacker as Carl Johnson, the one escapee that they could not find. Carl was one of the worst. He was a full-fledged cannibal and torture enthusiast, kept his victims alive for months. He broke into our house while evading the police and trashed the place to make it look like a normal robbery. Fucker even admitted to eating the family dog when he regained consciousness. He snuck into my wardrobe, and when I left in the truck, he snuck out and tied up David. He posed as him the next day to get me drunk so he could kill me in my sleep. He said he got hungry while waiting for the perfect moment to strike, so he helped himself to the raw meat I had in the freezer and some scraps of flesh that he peeled off of David. That's what got him caught. The cockiness is the only thing that stopped him from tearing me apart in my sleep. But that's not the scariest thing I found last night. Turns out Carl has a twin, just as fucked up as he was. They said only 4 broke out, but because him and his brother looked so similar, they chalked it up as only one guy. They still can't find him. So, I'm ending with this. Tonight, check under your beds, your closets, make sure your neighbors are exactly as you remember, because another Johnson is loose, and they are always hungry. When I was 11, my grandfather was telling me a ghost story one day when I had said, "There are no such thing as ghosts, Grandpa." "Are you sure about that, kiddo?" he had said, with a look of genuine excitement in his eyes. "Absolutely." "I am going to teach you a trick today, kiddo. Look," he said, while raising a finger in front of me. I kept looking at the finger in front of my nose, but I could not see anything else other than his hovering finger and his eager face waiting for me to say something. "I don't really see anything, Grandpa," I blurted out finally. "Obviously you cannot yet. While looking straight, look at the corner of your vision," he said. "How can I look at 2 places at once? Just look straight, kiddo, and try focusing on the left or right corner of your vision without looking at it." I tried doing that, but perhaps I had rolled my eyeballs to the left a bit, too much, at which Grandpa screamed, "No! Keep your eyes fixed on me. Then try focusing on what's at the left and right corners of your visual field. Don't move your eyeballs. Don't you see anything?" I tried doing what he said. I saw nothing. "I don't see anything, Grandpa," I said, and watched the excitement on the face of my grandfather drain away. With a disappointed sigh, he said, "Maybe you will, someday." I didn't tell anyone about this interaction. I'm glad he told me this, since this would end up saving me soon. My grandfather passed away when I turned 13. I wish I could tell you that my family was sad and everyone was devastated, but they were not. My grandfather was considered weird and creepy by everyone in our family. After Grandma passed away, he tried committing suicide by jumping off a building. That failed, but the damages to his brain were substantial, and he wasn't the same person after that. He would sit alone and talk about weird things at himself if he didn't find anyone else listening to his make-believe stories. He was an avid believer of ghosts and demons and believed he would never die. During the past year of his life, he would drink all day and deliberately urinate at different corners of his room walls, saying he was creating a demon trap. My mom had to clean all that up. As morbid as it sounds, he was a major burden to all of us during the final year of his life, and my parents were more or less relieved that he was gone. My grandfather's room was assigned to me, while my elder sister got to keep the room upstairs. I was initially ecstatic about this. This was the first time I would have a room all to myself. I started to regret it terribly from the very first night. That first night, all of a sudden, my bed had started shaking in the middle of the night. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately pushing the bed. I was so afraid to get up. That's when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps near the wall. All my senses were heightened at that point. I felt as if I could hear someone breathing next to me. I had never been that afraid in my entire life. I felt frozen on the bed, unable to move my body. Sometimes a fear of the unknown is more preferable than facing a real concrete danger. I pretended to be asleep, hoping that whatever was in that room would leave me alone and go away. With my eyes shut, I curled up on the bed and tried not to scream. I thought that not opening my eyes would make it go away. That's when it happened. A set of cold hands grasped my legs firmly. I did what any 13-year-old would have done at this point. I screamed at the top of my voice. As I screamed, the grip got tighter, till my mom rushed into my room, flinging the door open. She turned on the lights to see her 13-year-old son sweating profusely and scared shitless. There was no one else there. Whatever was present a minute ago had suddenly disappeared as soon as my mom came in. I told her it was a bad dream, and I would convince myself that it was, till the same thing happened on the next night. Keep in mind that I was only 13 years old at that time. The next night, when it happened, I did not scream. As soon as I heard the footsteps, I got out of the bed and ran towards the switch to turn on the lights. The room was empty, but it still felt occupied. I could still hear footsteps near the wall where my bed was located. The lights apparently didn't make it go away. That's when I noticed it. At the corner of my eye, I saw my grandfather sitting, smiling in the creepiest way possible, showing as many teeth as he can, smiling from ear to ear. I looked towards the corner directly, and there was suddenly nothing there. Again, I tried looking at it through the corner of my eyes, and there he was. He had the widest, toothy grin plastered across his pale face, and it seemed as if he was trying to reach for me from the corner of the room. I would never forget that creepy smile, and to this day, simply thinking about that gives me chills. It wasn't my grandfather. It couldn't be. To this day, I firmly believe that it wasn't. It was some otherworldly creature with my grandfather's face. It had crooked legs and thin hands, and its thin, pale body was filled with scars. The sight of it made me sick to my stomach. The thing tried to reach out to me, keeping his grin intact, but it couldn't move towards me. It was then that I realized that whatever that was couldn't move away from the walls of the room. I tried moving the bed, trying to bring it towards the center, but I couldn't. I was just 13 at the time, and all this had terrified me so much that I chose to keep the lights on and sit at the center of the room that night. I kept checking the corner of my vision, but it was soon gone, but I was too afraid to sleep that night. My mom found me sleeping at the center of the room, on the floor. That morning, after an awkward breakfast, I decided to move my bed to the center of the room where it couldn't reach me. Mornings seemed so much better than nights. That night it came again, like it did on all the subsequent nights after that, but I was safe and away from its reach. I slept with the lights on for a couple of days, but then I started turning that off. On some nights I would find excuses to sleep over at any of my friends' houses, which my parents were cool with, but that was rare and probably twice a month. The rest of the days I would sleep at noon and pretend to be asleep at night, always vigilant of its presence. Every night it would make sounds, scratch the walls, and try reaching for me from the walls of the room. I was only safe because my bed was at the center. Had my crazy grandfather not taught me the corner vision trick, I would have never realized how to get away from it. Every night it came, like a recurrent dream I couldn't escape from. You might think that, after a while, I got used to it, but one can never get used to something like this. Each night the thing came back to haunt me. Each night felt like hell. The fact that my bed was at the center and I was sure it wouldn't be able to reach me was what helped me to endure all those years. This went on till I went to college in another state and had to move away. I wish I could tell you that all was in my head. This was just the overactive imagination of a 13-year-old and nothing more. No, it wasn't. You could choose to believe whatever you want, but I will tell you this. Last year, while I was away, my parents had decided it was time to renovate their own room after my dad's promotion. So, for a week, they decided to use my room downstairs and sleep there, till the renovation of their own room was complete. They managed to stay there for 3 days. They spent the 4th day packing their stuff and moved to a new place on the 5th. I am 22, and this incident happened a year and a half ago. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of moving in. The door that led into my apartment locks itself automatically when closed, so I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail. While talking on the phone with my boyfriend, I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed. While opening the mail, while using the phone, I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under my bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still, with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I could not see his face. And he didn't see me. Trying to be rational, while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone, said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back." The bathroom is right by my bed, so I hastily walked in, quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, jumped out of my window and called the police. They told me not to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out of the door of the apartment complex. This was during summer, and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car, while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend, and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys, and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out, holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that had stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house, told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives, waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept into my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid under the bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. The nurse entered the room about 5 that evening and listened to the low hum of the heart monitor flatlining. She ran over to the machine and checked it to be sure, then turned to me and my wife and then lowered her head apologetically. "Would you like me to call someone?" she asked. I stood up and then nodded before answering. "Reverend Patrick. I have his number as one of my emergency contacts." The nurse gave me a soft hug and then left the room, gently closing the door so that only silence filled the air between my wife and I. After we were certain she was gone, my wife walked over toward me. "She is really gone, isn't she?" Vanessa whispered. "It was inevitable," I told her. "Was it? Was there anything else we could have done differently, Robert?" she asked. I helped her gather the gifts as the doctor returned with a chart. "Mr. and Mrs. Colton, I'm Dr. Hendricks," he said. We waited beside the bed as he placed the chart back down. "I'm curious about your daughter's condition. It seemed as though the chances of improving with chemotherapy were almost 76%. Hendricks stated. "God wanted another angel," Vanessa said with a sigh. "If you don't mind, I wanted to perform an autopsy on her body," he said. I frowned and snapped back. "You want to cut our little angel open?" "It is standard procedure." Vanessa frowned. Her face went white. But there was nothing we could do. The nurse returned a few moments later and they took her body. "Robert," Vanessa said as she squeezed my hand. "I know," I muttered. I knew what they would find when they performed the procedure. "We need to leave," she insisted. "The Reverend isn't here yet," I told her. "They are going to lock us up," she said, frantically. I held her close as she started to cry. "I hate you," she snarled as she pushed me away. I couldn't find any words to say except, "The Reverend will make this better. He's a good man." Less than 10 minutes later, the doctor returned. "Mrs. Colton, may I speak to you privately?" Hendricks asked. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it to both of us," I snapped. "Very well then. It would seem we found traces of arsenic in your daughter's bloodstream. There was also indication of bruising around her neck," Hendricks said. My wife could not hold back her nervousness anymore. "Those marks are from my hand, doctor," Vanessa said as she sobbed bitterly. Hendricks seemed taken aback by her confession and said, "If you wish to make a statement, I can contact the police immediately." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. My husband had nothing to do with this. The team of nurses left hurriedly to call the authorities. Vanessa and I were alone again as I squeezed her hand again. A mix of emotions floated over me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Someone has to dispose of the body, Robert," she snapped back. About 5 minutes later, the hospital security arrived and escorted her from the room. All of them looked at me as though I were to blame as well, if only they knew. When Reverend Patrick got there, he was carrying his bag in his right hand and his Bible in his left. "Robert, I was hoping Vanessa would be here," he remarked softly as he closed the door. "Circumstances have changed," I replied. "Is this where it happened?" he asked, staring at the empty hospital bed. "Yes, I'm sorry to ask this of you, But there isn't much time, I said. My son, he paused and put his hand on my shoulder. God always makes time for his children. He took out some soft white powder, and as he sprinkled it around the bed, he chanted a simple song. To whom shall I give this baby? There isn't much to say. I'll give it to the hollow man, who plague us day by day. Sleep now, dear child, and go run and play. Play in God's garden, where hollow men dare not stray. Then he took out a small knife. Take this, he told me. I looked at the sharp blade and nodded, knowing my job was almost done. I slept there in the room for another hour until the doctor returned for me to fill out paperwork. Will I be able to take my daughter home? I asked him. The coroner has already taken her. Hendricks responded. What? Where? I asked frantically. I pushed the paperwork back into his hands. I need to be there, I insisted. He wrote out the address for the funeral home, and I drove as quick as I could to find it. They were already embalming her body when I arrived. You have to stop, I shouted. The funeral director looked at me like I was a madman. Please, just let me see her, I begged him. He nodded quietly and led me to the room where they had started the process. I need a few moments alone, I told him. The director closed the old rusty door and I stared down at my young daughter. There was no time to delay. I plunged the knife over and over again into her body, laughing as I did, crying as I struck her corpse over and over until I was finished. My clothes were covered with blood. When the director returned and saw me, he shouted for someone to call the police. I let the knife clatter to the floor as I waited for them. When they took me to the station, they asked me what my reasons were for doing something like this. I remained quiet as they questioned me until at last they realized I refused to speak. We can only charge you for being an accessory to a crime and disturbing a body, the police chief finally said. They would never believe me if I told them the truth anyway. When I got home the next morning after spending the night in jail, Patrick was awaiting for me outside my house. Thank you for providing my bail, I told him. Are you ready? He asked. We went down to my daughter's room to clean up her things. First, we started sweeping, decluttering the scattered bones that were across the floor. I took a mop and wet the head before trying to scrub the blood stains. The Reverend took a rag and helped me lift the chains into it. When we were done, it looked like a normal house again, like our nightmare was finally over. How long will Vanessa have to stay in prison? Patrick asked. The trial is pending. She wanted one of us to at least move on with our lives, I answered. You did the right thing, Robert, he told me. I thanked him as I left. Then I sat down and stared at the pictures, the ones she made us take. I could hear her laughing as we were forced to do her every chore. I'm finally free, I said as I listened to the silence in my house. I started to fall asleep, the first time in ages. When I awoke, I burned the pictures. I didn't want any memories. I was done with the whole thing. She was our whole world once, and we just wanted to see that world burn. I slept a few more hours and was finally awakened by the phone. At this hour, I thought it was just a prank. Who is this? I asked angrily. On the other end, I heard a soft giggle that made my hair stand on end. I hung up the phone quickly and began to sob bitterly into my hands. Maybe I will never be free. Hey there, and thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up. And if you like my videos and want to see more, subscribe to my channel. And I will see you all in my next video.